The moment Victoria stepped onto the tarmac, she knew something was off. Her jet was there, sleek and waiting, the glossy black exterior reflecting the golden glow of the setting sun. She had owned this aircraft for 2 years. Her name was on the paperwork. Her money had paid for every inch of that luxurious interior. But the pilot standing at the bottom of the stairs, an older white man with neatly pressed epaulets, was looking at her as if she didn't belong. "Ma'am, this jet is privately owned. You're not authorized to board," he said, his voice flat and firm. Victoria's brows furrowed. She tilted her head slightly, thinking she had misheard him. "Excuse me." The pilot's eyes flicked over her designer suit, the gold watch on her wrist, and the expensive leather handbag in her grip, but none of it seemed to convince him. "You must be mistaken," he continued, a hint of impatience creeping into his tone. "This is a private flight. I'll have to ask you to step back." The audacity of the moment stunned Victoria into silence. A cold wave of disbelief rolled through her. She had never been questioned like this before, not when flying commercial, certainly not on her own damn jet. Then, the pilot did something that made her blood boil. He turned away from her and called security. "Sir," Victoria started, but her voice was drowned out by the squawk of his radio. "We have an unauthorized individual attempting to board a private jet," the pilot reported, his voice steady, as if she were a trespasser, a criminal, a nobody. Within seconds, 2 airport security officers approached, their posture stiff, their gazes scanning her with the same dismissive skepticism. Victoria clenched her fists. Oh, they had the right one today. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and hit record. "Say that again," she demanded, her voice sharp, unwavering. The pilot hesitated. His gaze flicked between her phone and the security officers. "I said you are not authorized to board this aircraft," he repeated. Victoria turned the camera on herself, her fury controlled but electric. "This man," she said, motioning toward the pilot, "is denying me access to my own private jet." "Why?" "Because he refuses to believe I own it." One of the security guards shifted uneasily. "Ma'am, do you have proof of ownership?" Victoria's lips curled into a tight smile. Oh, she had receipts. She pulled up an email on her phone, her fingers moving fast, then turned the screen toward them. "Here's my ownership certificate. My name, Victoria Caldwell. Want to check the FAA registry? Here's the tail number." She rattled it off effortlessly, because she knew her jet better than she knew the back of her hand. The pilot's face paled. A tense silence filled the air as the security officers took the phone and double-checked the records. Then, the moment of truth. One of the guards exhaled sharply and handed back the phone. His expression flickered with something almost like embarrassment. "She's telling the truth." The pilot blinked. The truth settled over them like a thick, suffocating fog. The guards took a step back. But the pilot, he just stood there. For a long, frozen moment, it seemed he might try to double down. His jaw tightened. His fingers curled. Then, before he could say another word, a voice crackled through his radio. "Captain Reynolds, you're fired. Effective immediately." The blood drained from the pilot's face. Victoria's expression didn't change. She stared at him, waiting, watching, daring him to say something else. But he didn't. Because there was nothing left to say. Still, the weight of the moment clung to the air, thick with an unspoken truth. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding. This was about something much deeper, much uglier. And the world was about to hear every detail. But before we get to that, let's go back, because this story? Oh, it's just getting started. 2 days earlier, Victoria Caldwell had always known that power came with perception. People see what they expect. And for some, the idea of a black woman owning a multimillion-dollar private jet was simply unfathomable. But that had never stopped her before. At 39, she had built Caldwell Enterprises from the ground up, turning a small boutique marketing agency into one of the most sought-after firms in the country. Her company's roster boasted Fortune 500 clients, high-profile celebrities, and political figures. Success wasn't given to her. She had taken it, earned it, fought for it. And now, she was on her way to close a deal that would secure her legacy. The plan was simple: fly from Miami to New York, finalize a high-stakes partnership, and be back home by the weekend. Everything was arranged. Or so she thought. That morning, she had her assistant, Lisa, confirm the details of the flight. The crew had been briefed, the catering was set, and the aircraft was fully prepped. Nothing was out of place. Or so it seemed. The first sign of trouble. The first red flag appeared when Lisa called her from the tarmac. Victoria." Lisa's voice was hesitant, her usual confidence laced with uncertainty. Victoria frowned. "What's wrong?" "I'm standing in front of the jet, but there's an issue." Victoria stiffened. "What kind of issue?" Lisa sighed. "The pilot. He won't let me board." Victoria's fingers tightened around her phone. "Excuse me. He's saying I need to wait outside the restricted area for the real owner to arrive." Lisa's voice was dripping with sarcasm, but there was frustration underneath. Victoria's stomach twisted. This wasn't the first time she had dealt with ignorance, but on her own aircraft? This was new. "Stay put," she said. "I'm on my way." Face to face. 15 minutes later, Victoria arrived at the private terminal. The staff greeted her warmly. They knew exactly who she was, and escorted her through security without issue. But when she stepped outside onto the tarmac, she saw him. The pilot. Standing at the bottom of the jet stairs, arms crossed, face unreadable. This was the man Lisa had called about. Victoria walked up, heels clicking against the pavement. "I'm Victoria Caldwell, owner of this aircraft. My assistant tells me you refused to let her board." The pilot barely glanced at her. "Standard protocol. We have to verify passengers before boarding." Victoria narrowed her eyes. "Standard protocol? On a private flight?" "Funny," she said, "because I've never had that issue before. And I fly on this jet regularly." The pilot didn't flinch. "First time flying with me." Victoria exhaled through her nose. So that's how he wanted to play it. Lisa stood off to the side, arms crossed, clearly seething. "I already showed him my credentials, Victoria," she said. "He just doesn't believe me." Victoria studied the man in front of her. Mid-50s. Straight posture. A face that had probably never been told no in his life. "You can check my credentials too," she said coolly. "I will," he said. "But you'll need to wait here." Victoria stilled. Wait. Outside her own aircraft. Her patience was razor-thin. "Let me make this easy for you. I own this plane. I hired this crew. You work for me. So I suggest you do your job, or I'll find someone who will." For the first time, the pilot hesitated. Victoria wasn't raising her voice. She wasn't making a scene. She didn't need to. The power in her words was enough. Still, he didn't move. That's when she knew this wasn't about protocol. It was about control. And he wasn't about to let her have it. Victoria's phone buzzed. A text from Lisa. He called security. Her jaw clenched. Oh, so this was how it was going to go. Fine. Let them come. Because when this was over, he'd be the one who was escorted out. Victoria didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, 2 airport security officers appeared, their postures stiff and their expressions unreadable. It was the kind of presence reserved for actual threats. Not for a woman boarding her own jet. Lisa muttered under her breath, "This is ridiculous." Victoria remained still, her face an unreadable mask. She'd been in boardrooms with billionaires, held negotiations with CEOs who tried to outmaneuver her, and handled people who underestimated her from the moment she walked in the door. This was no different. The taller of the 2 officers stepped forward. "Ma'am, we received a call about an unauthorized attempt to board this aircraft." Victoria turned her full attention to the officer, tilting her head slightly. "Unauthorized." She folded her arms, making no attempt to hide her irritation. "So tell me, who exactly is authorized to board this jet?" The officer hesitated. His gaze flicked to the pilot, as if seeking confirmation. "She claims to be the owner," the pilot said, his voice laced with barely disguised condescension. "I was just following procedure." Victoria took a slow, deliberate breath. "Procedure? I'd love to hear the exact aviation law that requires the owner of a private jet to prove ownership to her own employee." Lisa smirked. That one landed. The officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, Do you have any documentation that proves you own this aircraft? Victoria pulled out her phone, unlocked it, and within seconds had the ownership documents displayed on the screen. She handed the phone to the officer. He took a moment to read, his expression shifting as the reality of the situation sank in. Lisa whispered, just loud enough for the pilot to hear, "Bet that wasn't the answer you were expecting." Victoria turned to the pilot, her voice cutting through the tension. "Now, what was it you were saying?" "Something about how I wasn't authorized to be here." The pilot's jaw clenched. He had no words, just that stubborn, unwavering pride refusing to let him admit the truth. But before he could say anything, the officer's radio crackled. "Confirming aircraft ownership. Victoria Caldwell. Everything checks out." The officer handed the phone back to her. "Apologies, Ms. Caldwell. You're cleared to board." Victoria smiled. Of course she was. She turned back to the pilot. Now came the moment of truth. "You called security on me," she said. "On your employer. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" The pilot hesitated. His eyes darted around, as if looking for an escape from the hole he had just dug. Then he made his second mistake. Instead of apologizing, he doubled down. "Look, I was just doing my job," he said stiffly. "I didn't expect—" Victoria cut him off, her voice as sharp as steel. "Didn't expect what?" Silence. A thick, loaded silence. Lisa chuckled under her breath. "Didn't expect her to actually own the plane, huh?" The pilot's face turned red. That was exactly what he hadn't expected. Victoria shook her head. "You know, I'd love to sit here and educate you about your biases. But frankly, I don't have the time." She turned to Lisa. "Get HR on the phone. I want his termination paperwork started immediately." The pilot stiffened. "Wait a minute." Victoria leveled him with a stare. "You had a chance to fix this. You chose to call security on your boss instead. Now, you can find your own way home." Lisa pulled out her phone, already making the call. Then, as if the universe had impeccable timing, another voice crackled over the pilot's radio. "Captain Reynolds, you're fired. Effective immediately." It was the flight director. The pilot's face drained of color. Victoria didn't even spare him another glance as she stepped onto the jet. Lisa followed, smirking. Well, that was satisfying. But as the doors closed behind them and Victoria took her seat, a strange feeling settled over her. Because while the problem with the pilot had been handled, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Victoria settled into her seat, exhaling a slow breath as the jet door sealed shut. The battle was won, but the war? That was just beginning. Lisa sat across from her, still buzzing from the confrontation. "I hope he thinks about this for a long time," she muttered, scrolling through her phone. "Man really thought he was gonna get away with that." Victoria let out a dry laugh, but her mind was already moving to the next problem. If the pilot had the nerve to deny her access to her own plane, was this a deeper issue? She tapped her fingers against the armrest. "I want a full report on the crew," she said. "Background checks, past complaints, anything that might indicate this isn't an isolated incident." Lisa nodded. "On it." The jet began to taxi down the runway, the soft hum of the engines filling the cabin. Normally, this was the moment Victoria would relax. She loved the feeling of taking off, of rising above everything below. But something felt off. She glanced at the cockpit door. Her new pilot had taken over seamlessly, but the tension from earlier still clung to the air. Lisa was typing away on her phone when she suddenly paused. Victoria." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "What?" Lisa turned her screen around. And that's when she saw it. A video. Posted just minutes ago. The caption, "Black woman denied boarding her own private jet. You won't believe how this ends." It had already racked up thousands of views. Victoria's stomach flipped. She clicked play. The video was grainy, clearly filmed by someone at the private terminal. It showed her standing on the tarmac, arguing with the pilot. The audio wasn't perfect, but the words were unmistakable. Then came the moment when security arrived, when the officer asked for proof of ownership, when the pilot stood there, refusing to acknowledge the truth. And finally, The moment the flight director's voice came through the radio, firing him on the spot. Lisa whistled. Damn. That spread fast. Victoria's jaw clenched. Who posted this? Lisa scrolled through the comments. Looks like some random traveler who was at the private terminal. But it's already been picked up by a few accounts. Victoria didn't need to read the comments to know what they'd say. She had been in the public eye long enough to predict the storm before it hit. Some people would be outraged. Others would make excuses, twisting reality to fit their own narrative. And some would use this as ammunition to tear her down. Lisa tapped her screen. Do we respond? Victoria thought for a moment. She had two options. She could ignore it, let the internet do what the internet does and let the outrage burn out on its own. She could take control of the narrative. Victoria sat back, considering her next move. This wasn't just about her anymore. The world was watching. And she wasn't about to stay silent. Victoria leaned back in her seat, staring at Lisa's phone screen as the video continued to rack up views. The internet was already dissecting the incident, and she hadn't even reached her destination yet. Lisa refreshed the page. It's blowing up on Twitter. Some people are calling it straight-up discrimination. Others are saying it's just a misunderstanding. She rolled her eyes. Of course. Victoria exhaled through her nose. She knew exactly how these things played out. Some would be outraged on her behalf. Some would deny race had anything to do with it. And others would twist the story into something it wasn't, painting her as entitled, dramatic, or worse. She wasn't new to this. But this time, she had an advantage. The facts were on her side. She tapped her fingers against the armrest. Pull up my PR team, she said. We need to get ahead of this before someone else controls the story. Lisa didn't hesitate. Within seconds, she had their head of public relations, Marissa, on the line. Victoria, I saw the video, Marissa said immediately. It's already circulating on the news cycle. We need a response, fast. Victoria glanced out the window as the jet soared above the clouds. What are we looking at? Marissa's voice was sharp, professional. News outlets are starting to pick it up. There's a statement from the airline saying they're reviewing the situation. But it's vague, no accountability. Meanwhile, Twitter is in full meltdown mode. Victoria smirked. Nothing like a little public humiliation to make a company nervous. Lisa raised an eyebrow. So, what's the play? Marissa didn't miss a beat. We control the story. You release a statement, not just about what happened but about why it happened. If you keep this strictly personal, it'll fade in a few days. But if you expose the bigger issue, bias in private aviation, the assumptions people make, this becomes bigger than just you. Victoria tapped her chin, considering. Do we go video or written statement? Video, Marissa said immediately. It's more personal. More real. Victoria nodded. That was the right move. Lisa tilted her head. You sure you want to be the face of this? We could have a spokesperson handle it. Victoria gave her a look. Lisa, do you really think I'm about to let someone else tell my story? Lisa grinned. Fair point. Victoria turned back to Marissa. Prep a statement. Keep it professional, factual, but firm. No soft language. We're not apologizing for calling out bias. Understood. I'll have a draft in 30 minutes. The call ended. Victoria exhaled, rolling her shoulders. She had been through enough storms in her career to know this one wouldn't be easy. But she wasn't the type to let fear dictate her choices. Lisa, however, was staring at her screen again, lips pressed together. What now? Victoria asked. Lisa hesitated. I don't know if this means anything, but... She turned the phone toward Victoria. It was a Reddit thread. Title, Former Employees Speak Out About Fired Pilot. This ain't his first time. Victoria's eyebrows lifted. She clicked the thread. And what she read made her blood turn cold. Victoria's eyes flicked across the screen, reading every word of the Reddit thread with growing intensity. This wasn't just about her. The post had been made by an anonymous user claiming to be a former flight attendant who had worked with a now-fired pilot, Captain Reynolds. And they had receipts. I worked with this man for over a year. The way he treated black passengers, especially women, was always off. He wouldn't say anything outright racist, but he'd find ways to make them uncomfortable. Questioning their seats. Asking for extra ID when it wasn't necessary. Making snide comments about their attitudes. There was this one time a black couple tried to upgrade to first class last minute. Totally legal, they paid on the spot, but Reynolds argued with the gate agent that something seemed off about the transaction. It wasn't his call to make. They had to get another supervisor to override him. I'm not surprised he pulled this with Victoria Caldwell. The only thing that surprises me? He finally got caught. Lisa let out a low whistle. Oh, this just got interesting. Victoria kept scrolling. More former colleagues had joined in, some anonymous, some verified with industry credentials. They all said the same thing. Yep, I remember him. Passive-aggressive as hell, but only to black folks. He'd smile to your face but lose your requests on purpose. If you weren't white, he just didn't respect you. I was a black flight attendant on one of his flights. He always questioned me like I didn't belong. One time he accidentally locked the cockpit door and left me standing outside for 15 minutes. Another flight attendant had to let me in. Lisa looked up from her phone, eyes sharp. So, not an isolated incident. Victoria's jaw tightened. She knew discrimination in aviation existed. But this was systemic. And suddenly, the incident on the tarmac wasn't just an insult. It was a pattern. Lisa nudged her. You thinking what I'm thinking? Victoria nodded. We're not just making this about me anymore. We're exposing him. She grabbed her phone and dialed Marissa back. Tell legal to get ready, she said the moment Marissa picked up. I want every complaint, every report, every document that mentions this man. If this isn't the first time he's done this, we're making sure it's the last. Marissa didn't hesitate. Understood. I'll have a full report in a few hours. Victoria ended the call, her mind already working 2 steps ahead. She wasn't just going to clear her own name. She was going to make sure this never happened again. Lisa smirked. Oh, they messed with the wrong one. Victoria's lips curled into a smile. Damn right they did. By the time Victoria's jet touched down in New York, the internet had erupted. The Reddit thread exposing Captain Reynolds had been shared thousands of times. News outlets were picking up the story. Social media was ablaze with discussions, not just about Victoria's experience, but about a much bigger issue, racial bias in private aviation. And the pilot. His past was catching up to him. Lisa refreshed her feed. Oh, this is getting ugly. For him, I mean. She grinned, reading aloud. A former airline employee just came forward. Said Reynolds had a history of complaints but was always protected because he had connections in the industry. Victoria wasn't surprised. She knew how these systems worked. People like Reynolds got away with their behavior for years because nobody ever held them accountable. Until now. Marissa called the moment Victoria stepped off the jet. We've got more, she said without preamble. HR from his former airline reached out. He was investigated twice for unprofessional conduct. No formal action taken, but they strongly encouraged him to retire early. Victoria rolled her eyes. Let me guess, so he could keep his record clean? Exactly. Lisa scoffed. So they knew he was a problem and just let him move on instead of actually handling it? Pretty much, Marissa confirmed. And it gets worse. Several black female pilots have now come forward, saying they experienced hostility from him too. One of them was even denied a recommendation for a promotion under his watch. Victoria inhaled sharply. This wasn't just a personal grudge. This man had actively worked to block black professionals from advancing in aviation. And now, the world was finally paying attention. Lisa's phone dinged again. Oh wow. Victoria, someone just emailed your company's general inbox. Victoria raised a brow. And Lisa read it quickly, then looked up, her expression unreadable. It's from a lawyer. Representing other former employees who want to file a lawsuit against Reynolds and his former airline. Victoria stilled. This had started as her story. But now, it was so much bigger than just her. She took a slow breath, feeling the weight of it all. This wasn't just about getting justice for herself. It was about making sure nobody else had to go through what she did. Lisa met her gaze. "So, what's the move, boss?" Victoria exhaled, then squared her shoulders. "The move," she repeated, her voice steady. "We make sure this man never flies again." Before we conclude the story, we want to hear from you. If you were in Victoria's position, would you take legal action or let it go? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Victoria sat in the sleek, modern office of her law firm, her hands resting on the polished mahogany table. Across from her, the lead attorney, Marcus Bennett, flipped through a thick folder labeled Reynolds case. "We have enough," Marcus said, setting the file down. "Enough testimony, enough complaints, enough evidence to ensure this man never works in aviation again." Victoria exhaled, the weight of everything settling over her. It wasn't just about Reynolds anymore. It was about every black professional in aviation who had been held back, dismissed, or humiliated because someone like him had the power to do it. It was about making sure the next Victoria Caldwell didn't have to fight this same fight. Lisa sat beside her, scrolling through her phone. "Public pressure is insane right now," she muttered. "The airline that used to employ him just released a statement saying they regret any past incidents and will be reviewing their hiring practices." She scoffed. "Yeah, now they care." Victoria smirked. "Typical." Marcus leaned forward, his gaze serious. "Now comes the real question. Do you want to go after him legally?" Victoria had already made up her mind. She nodded. "Yes. But not just him." Lisa arched a brow. "Oh. We're not just taking one man down," Victoria said, voice firm. "We're going after the entire system that allowed him to thrive. The airline that let him retire quietly. The hiring committees that ignored complaints. The industry that protects pilots like him because it's easier than holding them accountable." Marcus grinned. "I was hoping you'd say that." Lisa whistled. "Oh, they really messed with the wrong one." Victoria leaned back in her chair. "They'll learn." The aftermath. What happened next sent shockwaves through the aviation world. The lawsuit against Reynolds and his former airline gained traction, with more former employees and passengers coming forward to share their experiences. Some had been harassed, others denied job opportunities, and many had simply been made to feel like they didn't belong. Reynolds himself tried to deny the allegations at first, but the overwhelming evidence, plus his own recorded words from the tarmac that day, made it impossible. His pilot's license was revoked indefinitely. His name became synonymous with bias in aviation. And as for the airline, they quietly settled the lawsuit and implemented mandatory diversity training, but the damage to their reputation had already been done. Victoria didn't stop there. She launched a new initiative, Caldwell Aviation Equity Fund, to provide scholarships and mentorship programs for young black pilots and aviation professionals. If they weren't going to open the doors, she'd build a whole new runway. 1 year later, Victoria walked through the bustling private terminal, the same one where she had been denied entry to her own jet. But this time, things were different. The staff recognized her immediately. "Good morning, Ms. Caldwell," the concierge greeted with a smile. A young black woman, dressed in a crisp pilot's uniform, stood near the check-in counter. She hesitated for a moment before walking up. "Excuse me, Ms. Caldwell," she said, her voice filled with both awe and gratitude. Victoria turned to her. "Yes." The woman smiled. "I just wanted to say thank you. I just finished my flight training. I'm here today because of your scholarship." Victoria's heart swelled. This was the real victory. She shook the young woman's hand. "No," she said warmly. "You're here because you earned it." The woman's eyes gleamed. "Still, thank you for making it possible." As Victoria boarded her jet, she knew one thing for sure. They had tried to make her feel like she didn't belong. No. She was making sure nobody else ever felt that way again. The end. What do you think? Do you think Victoria handled it the right way? Should more industries take action against bias like this? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one.